Today's the 16th of October 2015. My name's Isobel Clarke and I'm here today to interview Ross Winters. Ross, welcome to the Royal College of Music.
Thank you.
I would like to start by asking you when and where you were born.
Oh, well, I was born in Walthamstow in 1951 and then I lived in Chingford for the whole of my childhood and a certain amount of my young adulthood as well.
And speaking of your childhood, how did you first get into music and recorder playing?
Well, my father was in the Navy during the war, and then when he came out, he went to Goldsmith College to train as a music teacher in the 2 years immediately after the war. And at that time, it was just when the recorder was starting to be used as an educational instrument. But being my father, he kind of took it very seriously indeed. And apart from using it in schools, as was the custom in those days, which is something we could perhaps talk about later, because in some ways it did a lot of good, in some ways it did a lot of harm to the recorder's image. But anyway, he started to teach me the recorder when I was 5, and I never stopped. I must have liked it, and I must have had a kind of aptitude for it, and I actually never stopped playing. It wasn't one of those things I gave up when I was 11, which so often happens.
Especially these days.
Yeah.
How did your career develop? How did you, because you said you continued playing the recorder.
Well, I took the Trinity exams when I was young, and then I played at, because my dad was interested in contemporary music, he was on the committee for the McNaughton concerts, which was a wonderful institution for promoting modern music in the 60s for certain, 70s, possibly 50s, I'm not entirely sure of its history, but certainly when I was growing up, he took me to a lot of those kind of concerts, so I heard a lot of contemporary music. And it just happened that one year they decided to do a concert of contemporary music written for young people. So I played Anthony Hopkins' Descant Suite when I was 10, and it kind of never stopped after that. I guess that probably was a bit of a launching pad, because I think people who are interested in the recorder were there and certainly heard about it. And then there was another conference on music and education. I think I was about 12 then, and I'm certain that Walter was there then for that one. I played a Handel sonata, and I think my dad spoke at it. And after that, the next thing would have been getting involved with the London branch of the Society of Recorder Players. So I used to go along to that. It was, then as now, there not many children went, not many young people went, but my dad took me and some of his other pupils, and we started going reasonably often to that. And then I started to take part in the concerts of the London Society of Recorder Players fairly continuously, certainly from about the age of 15, 16. Right through to sort of 2022 or something, which was very useful for getting known and meeting the people that were important in those days in the recorder scene.
Was there just one London branch back then?
As far as I know, yes. I'm not entirely sure about that, but this pulled in people from all around, I know, because Northampton was represented as well. But anyway, it was a fairly big event.
When did you first meet Walter Bergmann? At what point in your career? You mentioned that he was possibly at that conference.
Yes, I'm pretty sure that I would have met him then, and other people like Carl Dolmetsch, who might well have been at the same event. And then after that, it was particularly at the Society of Recorder Players meetings, and then at the London branch concerts. And the other thing that sticks in my memory is that my dad ran a consort of his pupils. There were 5 of us altogether, including him, when it was at its peak, and we played a lot. We played many places around England, and we went off to the Worthing Festival once, where Walter was adjudicating, and I think that I have a note somewhere that we won all 11 classes that we entered or something, and Walter was very impressed. So at that point, he definitely knew me from that point on, the age of 15, 16.
What was the name of that consort?
He was named after my father, Leslie Winter's recorder consort.
So your father was obviously quite an active recorder player.
Yes, he tended to be fair to him. He took it very seriously indeed. He wasn't naturally gifted as a performing musician, but he managed very well indeed, and it was a very high standard in its own terms, in its own day. Yeah.
How did your relationship with Walter evolve over the next sort of 20 years or so that you knew him?
Well, after that, the other thing that he did was he was instrumental in bringing Franz Bruggen across, and he arranged for Bruggen to give master classes in London, and that was a massive influence on me, meeting Bruggen, because I mean he revolutionised recorder playing. Subsequently, I've done a lot of work on the work that Karl Dolmetsch did in commissioning pieces for his Wigmore Hall concerts. So Dolmetsch made a phenomenal contribution to bringing the recorder into the 20th century, and that repertoire was kind of looked down on when I was young by the Dutch school of recorder playing, but it's now coming into its own and being recognised for the high standard of music that it actually is. I mean, people like Rubbra, for example, to name one of the best examples of Gordon Jacob, people who wrote many works for the recorder. So there was that influence in England, but then the thing that made the biggest difference was the standard of playing that was brought about by Franz Bruggen's genius, really. So one became aware of that, and then Walter brought him over and organised these master classes in London. So I was getting to know Walter quite well in my late teens, and then he was very good about writing references. So after I studied music at Oxford, I wanted to go to Amsterdam because it was the only place really in those days that you could study the recorder to a high level. There wasn't anywhere in England. So I had it in mind to go to Amsterdam. Walter was very supportive, writing references for the British Council and things like that, which meant that I could stay there for 2 years. First year was a bit of a struggle, but the second year I had a grant from the British Council, which he certainly was influential in helping me obtain. And then when I finished there, he invited me to teach at the Recorder in Education summer school, which used to produce leaflets something like that. It's all quite quaint, all this old printing, but that was how it was. That was in 74. Mm-hmm. So when I came back from Amsterdam in the summer of 74, I went to teach on that course for the first time, and I taught for another 5 years on that course. And Walter was there every year. He was one of the central figures. That course had been going in one form and another for many years. So I was getting to know him quite a lot in those days.
Back then in the 70s, when you had been at Oxford and then in Amsterdam studying the recorder, was there no recorder connection with any of the conservatoires in the UK or in England?
There was a teacher at the Royal College, I believe, Stanley something or other. Afraid I can't remember off the top of my head. But it wasn't, and Edgar Hunt was working at Trinity College.
Yes.
But I felt really that the level that Franz Bruggen had raised recorder playing to by then, which was the 60s and early 70s, was obvious place was to go to Amsterdam to study. Mm-hmm. And I was accepted by Bruggen as a student, but actually the year I left, he also left. He went to America. So I studied with one of his best pupils, Walter von Hauer. And when I was teaching here at the Royal College, I invited Walter to come over to give a masterclass, And I believe it's gone on virtually every year ever since.
To this day?
Yes, to this day, yes. So he's in his 70s now, I presume, because he was about 9 or 10 years older than me, I think. So that was a tradition which you have maintained, I believe.
Indeed,
yes.
Yeah.
So.
Did Walter Bergmann himself have any connection with any of the conservatoires?
He knew some of the people that were running them, that were involved in them. I have a letter from him where he wrote to somebody at the Royal Northern College of Music suggesting that they might like to engage me as a tutor. But as you know, the Royal Northern College didn't teach recorder as first study until this year, when I'm pleased to say one of my former students, Chris Orton, is now going to teach recorder as first study there.
Did he have any influence with your appointment here?
I don't think so. No. No, that came about slightly differently. I think that came about largely because Gary Carpenter gave me the idea of applying to teach at the junior college, which I think I started in '75, the year after I came back from Amsterdam. And then that just led on because I was active by then in concert giving in London, and that led on to teaching at the senior college in I think it was '78 I started, with David Wilcox was here.
Talking about Walter Bergmann's earlier life, did he ever speak to you about his emigration to the United Kingdom and his development as a professional musician? Because of course he didn't actually begin his professional career as a recorder player. He was a lawyer in Germany.
No, he didn't ever tell me about that. I think it was a story that people knew, but it wasn't something that he talked about, not to me anyway. But I mean, I know how it came about because he couldn't practice law in England, German law being different.
Yes.
And he had this, obviously had this tremendous musical ability and turned it to good effect in due course over the years.
And he had studied music back in Germany and in Leipzig, I believe.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about his career as a recorder player and as a continuo accompanist as well?
Well, I think probably you wouldn't say that he had a career as a recorder player in the sense that we would understand it. He certainly was never a recorder soloist. I'm sure, never attempted to play a recorder solo. I may be wrong, but that's not an image I have. So, but he was always to be found as a continuo player. So, whilst he knew a lot about the recorder, he wasn't really, I don't think, a soloist in that sense. Of course, he played it. He played it in ensembles. He played it on these summer schools, and he taught it. But that wasn't really the main thing. But he was certainly very confident and very able as a continuo player.
It's interesting because as a recorder player, he has this great legacy now, but we don't speak much about him as a continuo player.
No, but he was very proud of that side of what he did. He was very, obviously, he was very influential in playing for lots of people, like Bruggen and Deller and people like that. And also, he was, in his editions, quite interested in, well, he was part of a kind of a change of approach to continuo playing, I would imagine, because early editions would have been in strict four-part harmony almost. He prided himself on writing a lot freer parts, and on playing much more free and flexible textures. So it's a transitional period, really. He didn't play from figured bass, I don't think, as today's players would do, but he certainly moved well away from the former ways of playing kind of block four-part chords.
Where was he working when you knew him in the 60s and 70s as a continuo player?
As needed when playing with recorder players, I think.
So who were the players that he mainly performed with?
He was very supportive of young people. I can give you at least one example. I think it was a young Italian player called Amico Dolce, and I can certainly remember a concert where Walter was accompanying him in the Wigmore Hall one year. So probably, as far as I know, mainly involved in accompanying recorder players as occasion arose. Yeah.
Was he working at the BBC at all, accompanying?
I know that he did record at the BBC with people like Bruggen. I know that for sure. Yes. Yes.
And of course, the other area, as which you've already mentioned, where he made a great contribution was in editorial work and editing.
Yes.
So that was mainly at Schott, or was it all at Schott?
I think it was probably almost exclusively at Schott. There might be exceptions, but one always associates him with the publications at Schott's. And it was enormous, the output, absolutely extraordinary. Ranges from the real beginner level. I know he did, if we're talking at the real beginner level, I mean, there were books of duets published by Faber, but the bulk of things were with Schott's. And it was vast. It was educational music of all sorts. And then Baroque, many Baroque editions. And in those days, of course, there was still this element of discovery. There was such a lot that hadn't been published at all, whereas nowadays it's more a case of going over old editions and perhaps reissuing them in line with our contemporary thoughts on editorial practice. In those days, there was this element really of just discovering things for the first time.
But of course, a lot of those editions which Bergman actually worked on, they're still circulating today.
Yeah, they still are circulating. Yeah. Oh yes, yes, sure. I think the editorial practice has changed clearly, as we know that editors liked to impress some of their own ideas and thoughts on the edition in the early days and offer advice of articulation and ornamentation and all this sort of thing. And gradually that style of editing has moved on. Walter was sort of transitional in a way.
So the pieces which he edited with continuo, they weren't with figured bass.
Not solely with figured bass. The figures. No, I think a lot of them had the figures included, but of course they had his realizations as well. And on the edit, and gradually, perhaps towards the end, he was more limited. He was more responsible, one should say, for the continuo part, because there was a marvellous edition of all the Schott sonatas, which was edited by Franz Bruggen. And I remember playing the one in E-flat minor for fun with him on a summer school. It was the sort of thing that he thought was fun, to see if he could play in E-flat minor.
It's like a hard taskmaster.
Yes. And I suppose the most famous one, which I probably still use every month, certainly every year, is the Handel edition with David Lasotsky, which very much reveals the new style of editing, because that one is a marvellous edition with everything correlated, all the sources all put together. And Walter's contribution was, by then, perhaps more to do with writing the continuo parts, and the editing was done by people like Lasotsky.
And certainly that Handel edition, that's still in common use today.
Oh, it's still, yes, it's still the obvious one that you go to when you want to study Handel. Exactly. Yes, it's superb.
We've talked a lot about him as an editor. What about composition?
He wrote inspired by the recorder and for the recorder. I don't know all there is to know about his compositions, because the London branch, I show one of these. I mentioned these at the beginning, but there were an awful lot of these, and quite frequently his works were featured in them. And there's certainly one that has some extracts from something called an opera. Whether it was literally an opera or whether that was just a covering name for a large ensemble piece, I'm not sure. But I'm very moved and very committed to the works he did write for the recorder. The treble sonata is incredibly moving, and it's also quite a humorous piece. He had this great sense of humour, as well as obviously having a very sort of, well, moving past story, of course, because of what happened in the 30s. But he also had this tremendous sense of humour. So the piece is, there's one passage in the piece where he thought it would be funny if the recorder accompanied a grand piano. So there's a passage in the piece where the grand piano is right up here and the recorder's playing the bass line, that sort of thing. I mean, it sounds trivial, but he definitely told me that was a joke. But in the midst of this very moving piece and very, very well written piece, there's the Descant Sonata. And I played last summer with some colleagues on the National Youth Recorder Orchestra course. We played a septet. And another work, talking of National Youth Recorder Orchestra, there's also a piece for cello and recorder orchestra, which the National Youth Recorder Orchestra did some years back. And the other one that needs a mention, because it sort of ties up with what I was saying earlier about Carl Dolmetsch, is a pastorella for sopranino recorder and solo soprano, which, by all accounts, was very well received at the Wigmore Hall. I think it was encored on its first performance. So he didn't write a lot. He did a lot of arrangements and he did a lot of compositions, and they were good. They were of a high quality.
So he actually played quite a big role in that sort of creating a new repertoire for the recorder in the 20th century.
Yes, he certainly played a part, I'd say, yes. Because a lot of composers have tried it once and not done it again. But Bergman wrote many works, really, with recorder.
And for different combinations
And for different combinations, sure. Well, that's the thing about the recorder itself, isn't it? I don't know that, I mean, the recorder is such an amazing instrument from that point of view, being so flexible. You've got music for all standards and all combinations and all numbers of people. And he played a massive part in facilitating that.
In his own composition, there's quite a wide variety of standards, isn't there? From sort of, what we would call professional level to easier pieces.
I'm thinking more that, yes, the sonatas would be professional level. Yes, I'm not really aware of original compositions, although there were some. If you look at a book like First Treble Solos, which Faber published, there are actually original pieces by him for the beginner. Yes, there are a few. Yes, so that's true. Yes, sure.
What about his work at Morley College? Obviously, that was quite a lot earlier in his career in the UK.
Yes, I don't have first-hand knowledge or experience of that, but it was important, obviously, because that's when he did all the work on Purcell with Michael Tippett.
Did he ever speak about that with you? Did you have a conversation about that?
No, not with me, no.
And the Society of Recorders had been founded back in 1937, but he was really a key figure in its early development when it restarted in the 1940s.
Yes.
What can you tell us about his role in the Society of Recorder Players?
Again, I wouldn't like to be too definite about that, but I imagine I had a closer knowledge of it in the 70s because I was on the committee then, and the committee meetings were at his house in Belsize Park, and he was at the centre of it. There's no doubt about that. I'm pretty certain that one can say he was right at the centre of the Society of Recorder Players.
From 1946 to 1987.
Yes,
it's a long time.
Some people don't stop. Some people do the same thing many years running. Other people tend to change.
So he lived in Belsize Park.
Yes.
What was the house like? Was it a sort of centre of recorder playing and musical activity?
Well, in a way, yes, because it's. I clearly didn't see all of the house, but it was the rooms that we were in were well, the main downstairs room was fairly large, easily big enough to have a rehearsal in, because I played several concertos there with strings with him when we were about to play them for the Society of Recorder Players concerts. And he had a massive collection of music, of course, as well. And I believe he had one or two old instruments. I think he did own one or two original recorders. I've got a sort of memory that he might have had a fourth flute, a Bressan fourth flute, but I'm not entirely sure about that. Yeah.
Keyboard instruments as well?
Yes, of course, yes. And that was where he drew musicians too, from abroad and from this country. Do
you remember any of the musicians you met there?
Well, for me, again, it's a personal thing, but I remember having a lesson with Franz Bruggen in Walter's house.
So he actually taught there in his house?
Yeah. So that was one day when I was supposed to be at a tutorial in Oxford or something, and I didn't go to it because I went down to London and had a lesson with Franz Bruggen, which was remarkable, really. Bruggen was a brilliant teacher and managed to convey things very quickly. So although that's about Bruggen, that's about me, but also it's about Walter enabling these things to happen, isn't it?
Facilitated.
Absolutely, a facilitator for sure, yes.
Did his family live at the house in Belsize?
He had a wife called Greta, who I met many times when I was there. And I believe he had a daughter called Erica, but I don't recall ever meeting her, and I don't know if he had any other children.
She was probably grown up by that point.
Yes, I think so, yes.
So, obviously, having a very active musical life, and did he play a very active role in the Society of Recorder Players through all the years that he was the musical director? Yes,
I think he was very keen on amateur music making. So I think the things that one should note and respect and appreciate are just the fact that he would have conducted many, many meetings of Society of Recorder Players branches all over the country. He was...
So he wasn't restricted to London?
Not at all, no. He was in demand and welcomed, I would think, over that entire breadth of the United Kingdom for Society of Recorder Players meetings. So he would have had an impact and an influence on hundreds of people through that. And he was very keen on amateur music making and thought it was very, very important. And going back to Morley College, of course, it ties in with that. And also the same thing is true because he did so many adult recorder classes at the Marylebone Institute, for example. And in those days, he did an awful lot of adjudicating. I mentioned when we went down to Worthing, but he did a lot of adjudicating of recorder classes at music festivals.
All over the country?
All over the country, yes. Well, sociologically, I think the music festival movement is fascinating. I mean, it was at its strongest in the pre-television era, but even in my lifetime, there used to be classes where you'd get 20 children all playing the same tune. It's faded a lot in the last 30 years, I would say. It'd be interesting to study why that's happened. But it was a lot of eminent musicians were active as adjudicators.
Was he a sort of key part in popularising that, in encouraging young people to take part in these recorder competitions, or did that happen anyway?
I wouldn't think so. I think that probably that side of activity was already generated through the fact that the festivals existed and the recorder was taught in schools in large numbers. So there were ready-made classes of 30 all playing the same tune. But there was one thing that the Society of Recorder Players in those days was very concerned to raise the standard of teaching. That was one thing it did. So when I was on the committee, I remember I was a bit young to be much use at any of it really, but I was involved when we developed a kind of teacher's certificate and decided what were the criteria that would help people to learn more about how to teach the recorder well. So that was one thing it did. And another thing it did was in 1972, it inaugurated the annual competition, and I'm proud to say I won the very first one in 1972, playing Reisenstein's Partita, which in those days was considered a very difficult piece, and in many respects it still is, because it's one of those pieces where it's not entirely brilliantly written for the recorder, so it has its challenges, like the Berkeley Sonata, for example. So, but that was, in a way, that was a germ started by Walter and started by the Society of Recorder Players that eventually, of course, ended up as it is now with the International Merck SRP competition, which is biennial.
Going back to the teaching certificate, did Walter have a big role in that, developing it?
I think, yes, I think several of us did. Yeah, we all had an input into that. And it was an opportunity for teachers to sort of have some kind of syllabus and some kind of guidelines and some kind of assessment.
Do you know what his opinions were on the recorder in education? Whole class recorder
Actually,
and so
no.
on?
No, it would not be wise to speculate.
Probably not.
No, I can give you my opinions, but not his. So,
speaking about his colleagues, other musicians who he worked with during the years that you knew him, and also before as well, do you know much about his relationship with Walter Bergmann and Michael Tippett, who he both worked with at Morley and also at Schott, I believe?
I don't know really anything more. Certainly, I don't know anything about Walter Bergmann, and I only know Tippett, the collaboration with Tippett at second hand, but it played a part in the rediscovery of Purcell for sure. So no, I can't really add much to that from personal knowledge.
Now, one thing that you did mention before was the masterclasses with Franz Bruggen. You've got one of the programs there.
Yes, I brought one, which is just here. Again, this is how it was done in the pre-computer age. The very basic typing there. But they were inspirational. There's no doubt about that. People like David Lasotsky were there. And of course, what we haven't said was that I wasn't the only young person that Walter was very supportive to. He was very keen on supporting young people. If you go through the list of names on the London branch programmes, for example, there are a huge number of young people, very skillful, able young recorder players, and who he accompanied and who he encouraged. So he was extremely keen on supporting young people, and really bringing Bruggen across was just an extension of that, and they were very special in their time.
How many of those masterclasses were there, do you remember? Was it a big number or just a few one-off?
I would have said there were several, but I don't think they didn't become a tradition.
And what kind of repertoire was played in the classes? Was it all sorts or mainly
Well,
Baroque?
yeah, we can tell you that in detail, actually, because it's right here. I played a sonata by Barzanti, but you've got Poulenc's Flute Sonata.
Played on recorder?
Played on the flute.
Played on the flute?
Telemann Sonata, Telemann Fantasias, Barzanti, Bach, Greensleeves. That'll be the division flute version, I should think. So, by Kerry Carlill, which is another name I remember. I think he was a pupil of mine at the junior RCM, just a bit later than that. Yeah.
And where did those masterclasses take place?
They were in London. This particular one was it Rudolf Steiner Hall? Yes, it was Rudolf Steiner Hall.
Do you know anything in particular about his professional collaboration with Alfred Deller?
No,
speak?
No, that's not something I was a party to.
Are there any other people who you particularly think we should talk about in the context of this interview? Any names that I've not mentioned?
I think we should put Edgar Hunt, Carl Dolmetsch and Walter Bergmann together, really.
Quite a trio.
Yes, it is. They were very, very important, and I think by and large they cooperated and collaborated, and all of them made a vast contribution to the development of knowledge about the recorder, repertoire, technique, editions, amateur music making. Edgar, of course, taught at Trinity, so he was one of the first people to do work at that level. Yeah, and Dolmetsch's contribution, as I said earlier, getting commissions for virtually 50 years worth of commissions for annual concerts was enormously important. So putting the three of them together, I think, is very much part of... He was absolutely central to the history of the revival of the recorder in the 20th century, I think, as were the other two.
What about the early music movement generally, which was...
Yes, I don't think you could say that he was on the verge of the way it is now, with the using original instruments and things like that. Wasn't really discussed. It wasn't, perhaps the time wasn't quite right for it. Certainly the editing style, as we've said, is more about discovering music than perhaps because he was mainly dealing with young people and amateurs. He wasn't really involved in the highest quality professional performance of early music as we understand it nowadays. So
but that was also something that developed later.
Yeah, sure.
And do you think he was supportive of that when it did develop? Did he speak about his
No, I couldn't
feelings?
say for sure. It would be not wise.
Yes.
To say for definite.
Moving back to Walter Bergmann's emigration experience, how do you think that shaped his musical career? Was that something that ever came up in discussion, or was it something that you spoke about with others? Would he have gone into professional career as a musician if it hadn't been for that?
I would imagine not, really, no. No, I would imagine it was more a case of using the talents that he had as a musician to lead a different life once he came to England.
Do you think in a way it was a sort of opportunity?
Yes, definitely. Oh yes. Yes, if you look back at the amazing breadth of what he did, because he had that talent and ability, I think it was definitely an opportunity to have a second kind of life rather than being a lawyer.
One that there might not have been an excuse for if he had remained in Germany.
No, and with a life like that, the kind of seeds that it sows and the effect that it has goes on and on. I recall the nights that I played his sonata for treble in an ordinary state school in one evening in Cromer in Norfolk, where I used to live, and I told his story about the emigration and that sort of thing, and the fact that I knew him and played the piece in the past. And there was a girl in the audience there who ended up coming to the Royal College to study the recorder. So that's one, and has then gone to Amsterdam and has become a very, very fine recorder player indeed. And that's just a very small example of the effect that a life like that can have. I think it's remarkable, really. The seeds that are sown and the ripples that are formed, and it goes on.
Speaking about that side of it, two things which we've touched upon are the competition,
yeah,
and also the Walter Bergmann Fund.
Oh yes, yes. Yes, we haven't mentioned the fund, but in a way that shows just the esteem that he was held in. I think it's been an absolutely wonderful thing that the Society of Recorder Players set up the fund in his memory, and I think it was funded on the royalties of his editions. Obviously, subsequently, it's received donations from other sources, but that was, I think, how it started, and it's entirely a fitting legacy that fund has helped so many young recorder players to develop their love of the instrument and their ability. I've written dozens of references for pupils asking for funding for buying their first wooden recorder, for example, which is always a very special thing. So yes, it's a wonderful legacy, and that continues. That definitely continues.
And the competition, which, as you mentioned, now it's an international competition.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little more about the beginnings of the competition? How instrumental was Walter in setting it up?
I should think, without knowing absolutely, that he was thoroughly behind it, because it was an SRP initiative. It would therefore have definitely been discussed at the Central Committee meetings, and he was definitely there. So I would assume that he was thoroughly in favour of it.
And that's again the seeds of something which
has
very
much
grown.
Well, it has, yes. It's another good example of a seed that has grown, really.
Another thing that I was wondering about the competition,
yes.
What was the format of it back then? Was it similar to how it is now with, 3 finalists performing a programme each?
I know, you'll never believe what it was like. It was extraordinary. It was a bit like the music festivals I described earlier. It wasn't quite 30 children all playing Reisenstein, but there were probably at least 20 adults of all ages playing Reisenstein. So the poor adjudicator listened to 20, I think quite conceivably as many as 20 versions of this piece. My dad took notes on it, which I have somewhere, on a vast number of these entrants. So that's what it was like. They picked the Reisenstein because it was one of the hardest pieces known in those days. That was before it was actually more or less at the same time that Bruggen's first few avant-garde pieces started to come into print, like Gesti and Shinohara, that sort of thing. But it's certainly of the conventional repertoire, that was a very demanding piece. So that's how it began, and it continued annually for several years, and like that in England, and then gradually, at some point, Merck and SRP cooperated, and it gradually became international.
You mentioned the adjudication. Who were the adjudicators? Did he adjudicate himself?
No, they chose a composer, John Joubert, as the adjudicator on that occasion. They just had a single adjudicator.
You've mentioned Reisenstein a few times. Did Walter have a connection with him? Did they?
I think that was a coincidence, really.
A coincidence.
Yes, that piece was chosen. I don't really know if they knew each other.
They hadn't worked together, collaborated,
Not to my knowledge. I don't think so. I don't know about that.
And what was he like as a person? Just for those of us who haven't had the opportunity to meet him, like myself, did he have a German accent when he spoke? Was he very German?
Yes, he had a German accent, which he did nothing to improve. One can only guess at why that might be, and it would be foolish to try and imitate it. But I can remember him referring to the orchestra as the bent rather than the band and that kind of thing.
He was quite.
And he had a great sense of humour.
He was not young when he came here, I suppose. He was in his 30s.
Oh, yes, he wasn't young when I knew him, because he was born in 1902, wasn't he?
Yes.
I don't think we mentioned that, but I'm pretty sure it was 1902.
He would have been in his late 30s when he came here. So
that's right, yes.
Late
so
to
he
change
would have been late
accent.
50s when I knew him. And one has to say that in those days, late 50s appeared old, whereas nowadays it doesn't. So, by any means.
So this is the programme for his 80th
Yeah, so this is the programme for Walter's 80th birthday concert, which was held at Morley College, most appropriately, and in 1982. And this one tells us that all the works were composed or edited or arranged by Walter. So you've got, there's a drummer boy, a story in music after French folk song. It ranges through Purcell's songs, sung by Ilse Wolf, Greensleeves, Barzanti Sonata, and then the Chaconnietta that I mentioned, the Pastoral for countertenor and recorder, the Sonata for treble that I mentioned. And most appropriately, the presentation to Walter was by Sir Michael Tippett on behalf of the Society of Recorder Players. So, so that was a very special event in '82.
So he was, you know, he lived till his late 80s.
Oh yes,
yeah.
yes.
I suppose going back to the fact that he was in his late 30s when he arrived in England from Germany, was he quite German in his personality? Did he make an effort to sort of become British? And
I don't think so.
no.
No, I don't think so. I think being German was part of him. He didn't seem to want to lose that. But he made a big contribution to British musical life.
With certainly some of the younger people that the people who came when they were younger, they did try to become quite British, but with him there wasn't really a sense of that.
Not really, no. He didn't try to lose his German accent.
Do you think he spoke in German with German colleagues?
Again, I would only be guessing. No, I would only be guessing.
So we've spoken a lot about Walter Bergman in the context of the early music revival in Britain in the 20th century, but how important was he for you personally as a musician, as a developing recorder player?
I think probably very important. It's not something you really realise at the time, but when you have the opportunity to look back and you just see how it fitted together, and I mentioned some of the basic things like writing references, that sort of thing, but also having someone like him expressing confidence in you is a big support. And when I look back over my own life, my father's role was central to my development, but I can think of other people like my uncle Geoffrey, who was a composer who studied at the Royal Academy, Franz Bruggen, of course, on the recorder playing side of things, and Walter for just the opportunities he gave me, and the fact that he expressed such confidence in my ability. Yes, very, very helpful indeed. Very valuable, really.
It sounds like he was an incredibly generous personality in a lot of ways.
Yes, that's right. Yes, he was. He was generous with hospitality. He would, at his house, he would take you out to lunch. He would send you copies of his latest editions and all these sort of things. So, yes, he was generous like that. Yes.
Okay. Somebody who's made a big impact in a lot of people's careers.
I think so. Yes, I think so. Yeah, yes.
Well, thank you very much, Ross, for coming to speak to us.
Thank you, I've enjoyed it.
No, it's been lovely to hear about your memories of Walter and the influence he had on your recorder playing career.
Okay, fine, thank you.
Thank you very much. This is one of Walter Bergmann's editions for Schott, James Hook Duettinos. For Descant and treble recorder, we're going to play a rondo from this book. So these would have been aimed at the student, amateur, professional market?
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah. And James Hook was a very attractive early 19th century composer. So, but writing in a classical style, it would have been attractive music for amateurs to play.
So this is one of the rondos from this book.